All right, this is the 2012 array question. Back at that point, we had interfaces. Interfaces are no longer on there. Now, just think of it as a class. So we have a horse class. In the horse class, the object contains its name and its weight. Then we have a horse barn class, and it contains an array of horses called spaces. Part A, we're going to find a horse with a certain name, and then part B will consolidate. So A, they told us they have an object called Sweet Home has horses. So this is your array name, and it says Sweet Home dot find horse trigger. So if I'm looking for trigger, it should give us position 0. If I'm looking for silver, it should give me position 2. And if I look for Cocoa and they don't exist, then it returns a -1. Whenever you get to the AP test, the first thing I'd like to look at is this box. It gives you kind of all the information that they gave you or that you will be finding. So it's a nice place to go, oh yeah, what was that array's name? What was that variable's name? So we have an array of horses called spaces, and then we have horses. So write the find horse method. So they usually give the method headers on the AP test. The only time they don't give you the method headers is if it is the class question. And on class questions, you've got to be able to write it yourself. So let's see. Remember, our array was called spaces. It was an array of horses. So we have horses, a horse array called spaces. So what we're going to look for is a horse with a certain name. And then we also had the get name method. So let's see what we're going to do. We have, oops, not 5. We have some imaginary horses here. So maybe this is horse A. This is a null horse, meaning there's not something here. Horse B and C. So I'm going to look for finding horse C. So as I go through, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look and say, we're going to have to traverse this array. We're going to ask, is there a horse here? If there is a horse here, then you're going to see if the name's the same. It's not. Is there a horse here? No. Do not call the get name method. There's not a horse there. Is there a horse here? Yes. Does it have the same name as this? No. Is there a horse here? Yes. Is it the same name? Yes. So we'd return this index. So 0, 1, 2, 3. And if we don't find it, we return -1. So we're going to have to traverse the array. Now, I can traverse using an enhanced for loop or a regular loop. I'm just going to go ahead and do a regular because that's what most of you still prefer. So for, ooh, sorry, I hit the wrong one. My pin got messed up. Okay, so for int I equal to 0. This is a regular array, so it's going to be less than spaces.length. So we have to pick up a horse. So if we're going to pick up spaces I, and the first thing we need to make sure is that it's not equal to null. There has to be a horse there in order to call a horse method. And now we're going to grab that space, that horse at position I again, and we're going to use the .getName method. So this right here is grabbing our horse. This right here is getting its name. And then we need to know if it dot equals the name we passed in. So if that's true, Then we're going to return I. If we make it all the way through the loop without finding a horse, you're going to return -1. So most of the codes you're going to write on the AP test are going to be fairly short, 4 or 5 lines. If you get more than that, then you've probably approached the problem wrong. AP grades very specifically, so even if you don't know how to do the entire problem, please write some things down. The first point came from traversing spaces with no air bounds. We can all do that. The next one is checking for the null reference. I think that's one we forget a lot of the times, but AP tried to lead us to that by putting nulls in the horse spaces. And the last one, when we check if it's equal, and the last point from this section goes from returning the correct thing. All right, part B. Part B is consolidating. So what we're gonna do is move everybody over. So silver is gonna move over to this null spot, and then patches is gonna keep moving over. Okay, so writing the consolidate method. So over here we have an array of horses called spaces. And we have some horses, we have some null spots. So we can try to look for null, and once we find our first null, traverse after that to find our first horse and move it over there. But that's a lot of work to keep track of all that stuff. So what I'm going to do is create another array of horses the exact same length as spaces. So I'm going to call this temp. So first thing I'm going to do is create an array of horses. So horses, temp is going to be a new horse array. And it's going to be of the same length as spaces, so spaces.length. Now, if spaces was in an array list, it'd be very easy to kind of just remove those nulls and then tack them onto the end, but it's not. So we got to do things a little bit harder. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have to traverse a for loop. So we're going to traverse spaces. Okay, so I is going to traverse my spaces, but as I put them in, they're not going to have the same index. So the index of A is going to end up being the same, but the index of B is different. So I'm going to call that J. Instantiate J outside of this loop. All right, so we're going to ask if we're going to grab an element in spaces. So if spaces at position I is not equal to null, that means we found a horse. And if we find a horse, we're going to have to copy the horse over to the new array. So then we're going to say temp at position J is going to be equal to what spaces was at position I. And then after that, we're going to have to increment our I, which that'll do that in the loop. But I'm going to have to increment J only if we add a horse. Okay, so let's check that so far. So if I is equal to 0 and J is equal to 0, is there a horse in I? Yes, copied over to J. And when we copied over to J, the first thing we do is increment J, finish off that part of the loop, we increment I. Then we ask, is there a horse at position I? No, there's not. So we're not going to do anything with that. We're not going to add it over, which means we're not going to increment J. Then we go over here. Is there a horse at position 2? Yes, there is. So it's going to be copied over to position 1. After you copy it over, you have to increment that position, finish off the loop. Now, this is pretty much almost all they need, but they called the array spaces. So we have to make sure that what we return is also called spaces. So we just need to say, okay, spaces is going to be whatever was in temp. This was void, so we don't have anything to return. So that's all of it. So how was this graded? 1 for traversing spaces without an airbound. 1 for checking for the null reference. 1 for having 2 different indices, 1 for incrementing J, and 1 for the temp, changing it back and returning the correct thing. Now, there are other ways to do this. I could have kept one array and kept track of different things. We could have moved the array to an array list, but then we'd have to turn it back to an array. And that's just too much work for me. It's much easier for me to create an array, copy it over, and then rename it.